Good afternoon. I'm Helena Riley, and I'm a cybersecurity consultant at CONSTEP. CONSTEP is Connecticut's manufacturing extension partner, and we're also a go-to center for cybersecurity for the New England states. With me today, I have Jeff Orzak, who is the Director of Strategic Growth and Technology at CONSTEP. So Jeff, tell us what we're going to be talking about today.
Good afternoon, Helena. Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the new interim rule. On September 29th, the DoD issued the long-anticipated interim rule introducing the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, as well as an interim process, the DoD Assessment Methodology, for scoring your current self-assessment. We will discuss the importance for every company in the defense industrial base to think about having a system security plan, a self-assessment, and a plan of action with milestones. Helena, before we get started, can you remind us of what was in effect before November 30th?
I sure can. So can you advance to the next slide, please? Before November 30th, there was a DFARS 252.204-7012, which we will henceforth call DFARS 7012, and DFARS is Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. DFARS 7012 is in contracts that include covered defense information. And if you have this clause in a current contract, you are at a high level obligated to do three things. The first is to provide adequate security to protect the covered information that resides or passes through your systems. And as we'll get into more in this session, part of how you determine if you have adequate security is to do a self-assessment against the NIST 800-171. Another thing that you have to do under this DFARS is if you have a cyber incident or a suspected cyber incident, you have to report to the Department of Defense within 72 hours. And you also have to provide evidence, preserve evidence of what has occurred. The third thing, which is very important, is that if you have subcontractors and you flow down covered defense information to them, you need to flow it down to them so that this clause should also appear in their contracts. Do you want to go to the next slide? No, back up one, please. Other way. There we go. So what the heck is covered defense information? There are a lot of different terms that you will see. You see some here. You've got controlled technical information. CUI, controlled unclassified information, is the broadest of these terms because it applies to all departments of the government. But it's basically information that requires a higher level of protection than your ordinary business information. This does not apply to classified information. That requires a higher level of protection than this even. So some things that you might see, you might have a drawing or a specification that has an ITAR stamp on it, or you might see an export control warning like this on a document. You might see a distribution statement D on a document. In the future, all of the government agencies are going to be required to very clearly mark what is controlled unclassified information with a purple banner and white letters, but we're not there yet, and it can be quite challenging. So Jeff, do you want to give us some more background on, okay, so we're protecting all this data. Why is it so important that we protect this data?
Yes, thank you. So protecting the data is important as cyber criminals and nation states are targeting the defense industrial base to get a military advantage over the United States. This is important to help protect the warfighter. In the DoD's view, cybersecurity is going to be a fourth critical measurement, in addition to quality, cost, and schedule, which are already critical measurements for the defense supply chain. In general, we'd like to create a more lethal joint force than our competitors, and part of that is by keeping our intellectual property more maintained than they do. And a good example about that is this week's announcement of several government agencies being hacked through a vulnerability in one of their supply chain members. So it's important to help it's important for the defense industrial base to help the military continue to have its advantage.
So Jeff, do you want to talk us through what's in this new DoD Interim Rule?
So the new Interim Rule has two constructs. The first is the Department of Defense's assessment methodology, which is a scoring system for your self-assessment. This is an interim process. They also introduced the implementation of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, which we've been expecting for a long time. That full implementation will not occur until 2025, but they've introduced what will be required in the meantime.
Now, I know that the new interim rule has 3 new DFARS that are going to apply to contracts going forward. Can you talk us through those, what those are?
Yes, so as with 12, there are 3 new clauses to DFARS. Clause 7019, 7020, and 7021. 7019 and 7020 apply to the defense assessment methodology and utilize NIST 800-171, while 7012 is what introduces the CMMC. The interim rule is broken up into those 3 new clauses. 7019 focuses on helping contractors utilize their self-assessment and enter results from that into the SPRS database. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. What's important here is that the DoD is now looking for a record of your implementation. This is to help address perceived flaws in 7012 in that the defense industrial base did not implement it fully and was using the POAM as a way to push compliance. 7019 and 7020 are both about implementing the scoring methodology, and 7020 is about allowing on-site visits if you are required to get a medium or high assessment, which we'll address in a moment. And then, as I mentioned, 7021 is the phased-in implementation of CMMC. Can you tell us a little bit about the Supplier Performance Risk System?
Yes, or Spurs, as it is sometimes called. Absolutely. So if you have current contracts that include the DFARS 7012 that require, the 7012 requires you to have completed a NIST 800-171 self-assessment, created a system security plan, developed a plan of action with milestones, and it actually assumes that you fully implemented all 110 of those requirements by the end of 2017. You all did that, right? Well, you don't have to have gotten everything fully implemented, but what they want you to do is enter a few pieces of information into this database. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that in order to do that, you have to set up an account. And you do that by going to the PIEE application, which is Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment application. You will need a cage code to create your account. Even if you're not ready to enter your data into Spurs yet, I'd advise you to get your account set up. Some of our clients, it's been quick and easy, half an hour, they had their account. Other clients that were missing some information, it's taken weeks to get it set up. So I would advise you get that part done. So some things they're going to ask you for. One is going to be the date of your most recent assessment. Now, another important note here is that your assessment cannot be more than 3 years old. So it has to have been done in the last 3 years to count. If it's older than that, then you need to complete another self-assessment. So you're going to put the date of the assessment. Now, Jeff mentioned the DoD Assessment Methodology. They have a system, this was developed by DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, a system for how you score this. I had one client who she implemented 80 of the 110 requirements, and so she was saying, Helena, so I put 80 in as my score. And I was, no, that's not what you do. The way you do this, you can look up the methodology, but you start with 110, and then you subtract either -5, -3, or -1 points for every requirement that you have not implemented. And there's a spreadsheet, you know, that'll show you what the scores, the appropriate score is for each requirement. So when they say total score, that's using the subtractive methodology. Do not be surprised if it ends up being a negative number. That is true for many of our clients. So don't be shocked if that happens. Now, another really important thing, in your plan of action with milestones, you have mapped out how and when you're going to remediate any requirements that you haven't fully implemented. What they're looking for is your final completion date, your projected final completion date, when you think you will have implemented 100% of the 800-171. The advice on this is to be honest and conservative. Don't underestimate how long you think that's going to take. You can go in and update these things. With something like your POAM date, you don't want to put in 6 months and then take a year and a half. That could be construed by DoD as a false claim. You'll also, if you have more than one system security plan, you need to put in the name of the one that you're using, and you include a brief description of your plan architecture. So let's see where we wanted to go next. Jeff, can you tell us about the 7021 and CMMC?
Yes, thank you. So just before I do that, I'll remind everybody that there's a question box to the right. If you have questions for us, we'll address those at the end of the talk, and please feel free to put those in. So the much anticipated cybersecurity maturity model certification was also introduced in this interim rule. DoD has been working on the CMMC for about 18 months. They released the first version of it last January, and we've been waiting to look at the implementation path that they plan to take. It's important to note that at this point, there are no certified third-party assessment organizations. There are only provisional assessors. And so as we move forward, there will be a phased implementation of the CMMC across contracting language. Also important to note in 7021, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainability is responsible for defining which contract CMMC is entered into at this point and up until 2025. CMMC is a certification method that will allow DoD to see who has completed their cybersecurity implementations. It is about being completed. So as we move forward, there will be, you will need to have full completion of all practices and requirements. When you after you receive your CMMC certification, which full implementation will begin in 2025, that information can also be entered into the Spurs database and will also be good for 3 years. CMMC, as a background, is broken up into 5 levels. Level 1, which will be for most, will be for all defense contractors, will include basic cyber hygiene. At this point, DoD does not anticipate utilizing level 2, so that's just a bridge gap for those working towards level 3. Level 3 will be equivalent to those companies that are currently being asked to complete NIST 800-171 and that have covered defense information or controlled unclassified information, which typically we see as ITAR information. One thing to note is that level 3 contains all 110 requirements from NIST 800-171 plus 20 different additional requirements and practices. And then levels 4 and 5 will be for companies that are facing advanced persistent threats and that the DoD is concerned that they're being specifically targeted for their intellectual property. CMMC is about practice and process and is looking to see a company's maturity. So that will be part of what the evaluation is. And as I mentioned, level 1 will be for all defense contractors who have federal contract information, and level 3 will be for most contractors who have covered unclassified information.
So, Jeff, do you want to tell us about some of the things where we don't know everything yet?
Yes, thank you. There's certainly a lot that is still open. While DoD has published this as an interim rule so that they could move forward quickly and are open to comments, we don't expect any substantial changes. This probably gives the direction DoD wants to follow for the next few years. One thing that's important is how it will apply across your entire network or any particular network segments or enclaves you put in place. We certainly recommend that as you write your system security plan, you look at segregating information so that you can control that information more carefully. It's certainly unclear in the interim rules how contracting officers will decide what is CUI. There is some understanding of what that is, but that is also still an open question, which is something we've seen similar with covered defense information in the implementation of 7012. The use of the DoD Assessment Methodology score is also unclear. It's not specified how a contracting officer will use that in decision making when they're looking at contractors. It's important to note that the implementation of 7019, 7020, and 7021 are on DoD contracts, and so they apply to primes. There is certainly a requirement that it be flowed down, but how it's flowed down from a prime to a subcontractor is really a customer-vendor relationship. It's also the information in the SPRS database is not public, and so primes will be looking for your attestation to understand that you've submitted your information to SPRS. We're also unclear how 7019 and 7020 will get put into exercise options. The interim rule talks about implementing those and any exercise options that occur after November 30th, but that would mean a recontracting process, and so that certainly has some risk for DoD as well as for the contractors. There was an interesting note that all CMMC assessments will be on site. Originally, that there was left open the possibility of virtual assessments for level 1. The fact that now they'll all be on site means DoD is looking for verification of implementation by contractors and subcontractors.
And Jeff, isn't there a rather potentially large cost associated with these? For the
certainly, yes, certainly cost. Again, because there are no certified party assessment organizations, it's hard to determine what the cost structure will look like. In their economic analysis of the new rules, the DoD did put some estimates, and they could potentially be substantial. And even for level 1, that does mean an assessor being on site for a day. So we are looking at additional costs for the subcontracting tiers that need CMMC certification. There's also no clear guidance on how contractors will flow down CMMC levels to subcontractors. It's certainly hoped that that will be clear in the language, but it's anticipated that a lot of primes will be actually level 5 or 4 because they'll be seeing advanced persistent threats, and the expectation would not be that they would flow that down. So how they make those decisions is not clear yet.
And we're part of we're part of the national MEP network, manufacturing extension partner network, and there's definitely talk about the cost burden that this may incur for small companies. And what, will DoD help out with that? Are they going to do anything to defer the cost, since they're going to be asking that companies do this? But that, I believe, that is also still kind of an unknown, correct, Jeff?
Yes, I mean, there's certainly many issues with that, and while DoD suggests it's an allowable cost, there are only certain contract types where that's clear, and it's certainly more difficult to apply to subcontractors. So that is still an open question. And then the last real concern would be the security of the SPRS database. As I mentioned, while the information is not intended to be public, we would highly recommend that clients don't put anything confidential or proprietary in there, so that their information stays protected. So Helena, can you tell us what companies should be doing right now?
Sure. The first thing on here is get yourself familiar with this, what is required for you to do. And if you haven't completed a NIST 800-171 self-assessment, and you can hire someone to guide you through that, the same way you can have an internal auditor help you before your official ISO audit. But that should be a real priority to get this done. And again, you don't have to have fully implemented everything, but find out where you stand, create a plan of action and a pathway to get yourself fully implemented, have a solid system security plan, figure out what your current score is so you can get entered into the database. But beyond that, first of all, an important point is, you may think, well, CMMC is coming, the 800-171 is going away. But it isn't, because it's the vast majority of CMMC level 3. And CMMC may go a little deeper into the same requirements, because as Jeff mentioned, they're going to be looking not just at your practices or how you do things, but the how you do things. So the what and the how. So they may go a little deeper on some of the existing requirements. But this whole process is something, and if you're familiar with the 800-171, you'll know this from having looked at it. But you are supposed to be doing an assessment every year. You're supposed to integrate this into your risk management practices so that cybersecurity becomes one of the things you are routinely assessing and managing as a risk. And that fits in with CMMC and will help prepare you for CMMC. Part of the how part, as opposed to the what, and this what they call process maturity is really, they will come in and examine your processes. Are they transferable? Are they repeatable? Do they have a self-assessment and evolution component to them? So that's kind of the future, but it's also in the present. So I strongly encourage people to actively kind of get up to speed. And again, remember that if you don't have to be done to enter your information into the Spurs database. You just have to know where you are and what your score is. So I think, I don't know, Jeff, do you have any final comments? And then we can open things up for questions.
Nope, I think we've stressed the importance of having a system security plan. All companies in the defense industrial base should be thinking about that, and doing a self-assessment, which could be guided with help, as well as creating a plan of action with milestones. So Helene, do we have any questions?
We do. I'm not 100% sure that we have a question. Do vendors have to submit to Spurs?
I'm not clear what they mean by vendors. So certainly subcontractors. So flow down of 7012 was also contained in 7019. And so primes are required to flow down the requirements, and that includes submission of their assessment results, the assessment methodology results into Spurs. What is unclear is how primes can utilize that. What we've seen so far is that they're looking for an attestation of your having submitted to that. But at this point, their primes are do not have access to the Spurs database.
And I guess, you know, another thing that isn't entirely clear is if by vendors, it was managed service providers that may be assisting a manufacturing company, for example. Right now, there's no requirement that flows down to them, but that's a bit of an unknown too, and that they sometimes have access to your covered defense information. And so how does that work? So that's a bit of an unknown. One other question, which I'll take if that's okay, is if I implement more requirements, should I update what's in Spurs? And the answer to that is definitely yes. You want your score to be as up to date as possible. And again, with your POAM final date, if you think you can get done in less time than you said, by all means, change the date. Hopefully, you know, put it far enough out that you won't have to push it out even further. But yes, it's not a one and done. You can absolutely make updates, and you should make updates. Does any more questions? If anyone wants to post one. No, I don't see any more.
So Helene, I see one. There's a question that's asking if a portion of CUI is incorporated into manufacturing documents, does that document become CUI? So that's actually a complicated question. It probably involves making some engineering decisions. Certainly there is the potential to remove the classification of CUI by only utilizing part of the information. I certainly did this when I was in manufacturing myself. But it does take engineering decision to understand whether or not what you're taking away gives any particular technical information that's connected to the reason that the part originally was CUI. So in most cases, we would say yes. That CUI does follow along as you take portions, but certainly with some effort, you could obfuscate that information.
think we have a question of what does SPRS stand for? Supplier Performance Risk System. That is what that stands for. Good question. And, you know, along the lines of the previous question, a way that you can, in some circumstances, avoid flowing down CUI is if you segment a drawing or a specification into these smaller parts that in and of themselves are not going to permit anyone to piece the bigger picture back together. And there's a somewhat related strategy. Some companies have covered defense information in practically everything they do. We have clients that every workstation on the shop floor has a huge drawing with an ITAR stamp on it. Other companies, that's not the case. They may have a relatively small amount of data that is covered defense information, and or maybe just one or two contracts. And for those companies, definitely investigate what we refer to broadly as segregation strategies. In other words, if you can isolate that data, maybe keep it in a separate server, keep it in different directories. Remember that that is what DoD is requiring you to protect. They're not requiring you to protect your entire system. So for some companies, depending on the amount of CUI you have, that can be a good strategy. So let's see. I don't see any additional questions.
I think Helene is having a little trouble with the question function, so I'll try to address some here. We're getting some more questions about Spurs and the assessment score. So one question was, when do you enter your information into the Spurs database? So if you're a contractor directly to DoD, you should do that after November 30th, but before your next contract award or solicitation. So that will help in that contracting methodology. For subcontractors, that's certainly a customer-vendor relationship issue. We have seen primes asking their subcontractors to do that immediately. So that's something to negotiate with them. And we certainly encourage you to talk to your buyer or procurement officer to help understand what's required. Also, there's some questions about the scoring. So in the defense assessment methodology, the top score is 110, but each of the 110 requirements has a rating of either 1, 3, or 5, which you subtract from that score if you don't meet them. So it is possible to go negative. As Helena said, this is not uncommon with some of our client base. And the score, I believe, if I've gotten the math correct, can go as low as -196.
If you haven't implemented anything, I think,
yeah. And it is important to note, your score, you cannot get a score if you don't have a system security plan. Yes. So it is intended that you start with a system security plan before you even begin scoring. So actually, that would mean you don't go to 196 because you get points for having a system security plan. But we wouldn't think 191 is a good place to start either.
Another way to think about it is if you don't have a system security plan, it's game over. You are not compliant with the 800-171. So right. As Jeff said, you gotta have it. So
there's a question about what happens if you enter a poor score and how that information will affect you. At this point, that's not clear. It's called the performance risk system because DoD wants to use it in risk management, but there's no clarity on what percentage or what portion of that will be based on just your score. So that's certainly open. One thing we would say is truthfulness and conservativeness are both important. There have certainly already been claims of false claims acts being held against companies that submitted attestation that they met 7012. And so we certainly see this as another place where DoD potentially can use contracting and legal requirements for companies that provide a false claim.
And DoD can sue for up to 3 times the cost of a contract for false claims, just as a little added incentive there. So,
So there is a question about the expense and the difficulty of small businesses meeting this. You know, it certainly will be a challenge, but we think DoD recognizes that small businesses are important to the supply chain. I personally also think that as this gets rolled out, we will see new market solutions. There are potentially over 300,000 businesses that need to comply, and many of those are actually small businesses. And so the market will potentially address this with solutions that are more right-sized for those companies. But part of that can be about segregating your network and you know, not trying to lock down the whole company as Fort Knox, but to figure out how to segregate the information and control that.
and Jeff, I wanted to add to what you said. The person who was asking about, gee, I have a poor score. I mean, entering your data into this database, that's like a step you have to complete so that you're on the list to be considered. And one thing about CMMC in the future is it's going to apply to RFPs, not just to your contract. So you're better off getting your information in there, then you're on the list, right? If you're not entered in, then you're not even on the list to be considered. And if you have a poor score, you won't be alone.
So there's another question about CMMC auditing and when they'll be able to get their first 3-year certification. As I mentioned, at this point, there are only provisional auditors, and DoD is putting out some initial contracts that will have CMMC auditing required. We believe that that will take a while for the marketplace to address those needs. DoD anticipates doing over 100,000 companies in the next 4 years before it is fully implemented. So that certainly will take time too. But at some point, we expect more auditors and third-party provider organizations to be in place. And so my expectation is that in a year to 18 months, you may be able to start scheduling an audit. But we certainly would suggest waiting until you get some guidance from your procurement officer or buyer. I don't know if I answered this in another question, but if you're a subcontractor, you are required to put your information into Spurs. Though, as I mentioned, it's unclear exactly how that will get tracked, but your prime will probably be asking you to do that. So there's a question, is it up to the primes to identify CUI in any documents? And if they do, does that affect how the vendor behaves? So the primes are responsible for identifying CUI, but that does not prevent you or is not an excuse for you to not protect it correctly. So you should be aware of what you get. As Helene alluded to, the definition of CUI and CDI can be very complicated. But if you see something marked, it probably is covered under those rules. And specifically for many of our clients, they're receiving ITAR documents or EAR documents. And those are most definitely included in the rules. And if you are seeing those, you should be concerned that you need to be following the flow down.
Oh, I think I am now getting a question. Will Prime stop allowing companies to quote if they haven't submitted? And I think that means submitted to Spurs. And the answer is you will not be allowed to bid on a new contract or be eligible for a contract renewal if you do not have your information in SPRS.
And so just to clarify what Helena is saying, that is for contractors to the Defense Department. They will not be allowed to bid at all. Certainly, we expect primes to start implementing something that will also be asking that you've submitted to Spurs before they allow you to do different contractings. But as I mentioned before, that is in the end going to be a customer-vendor relationship issue. And I think I have covered all. Just go through one more time.
To take a last look here.
All right.
Well, thank you all for joining. We will be sending out a link to this presentation afterwards, and feel free to reach out, if you have concerns. And we wish everyone a good luck and good speed on their NIST 800-171 CMMC journey.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.